Have you ever imagined what would happen if a cold and calculating tycoon, used to controlling everything around him, offered a fortune to a homeless young woman in exchange for something unusual, having a child? Seems like a simple deal, right? But what if this contract, created to avoid emotions, ended up becoming the catalyst for an unexpected turn of events, where love, chaos, and the improbable became protagonists? Get ready for a story where a signed paper is unable to control the heart. Are you ready to discover how lives can change in an instant? Robert Wallace sat in his black leather armchair, watching the Boston skyline from the top of his skyscraper. The silence of the apartment was interrupted only by the buzzing of the clock in the corner of the room, a sound he hated. He sighed, an almost imperceptible gesture on his always impassive face. It was at that moment that Mason, his personal assistant, entered with a tablet in hand, breaking the heavy atmosphere. "Mr. Wallace, the meeting with shareholders will be at 3 p.m. and, if you want to fill that existential void, maybe you should adopt a cat. They say it helps," Mason said with a slight smile. Robert raised an eyebrow without taking his eyes off the landscape. "Cats don't know how to manage actions, Mason. I need something that guarantees my legacy, not an animal that scratches the furniture." "Well, one option would be to get married. Having children is very effective for creating heirs." Mason shrugged, waiting for the predictable answer. Robert finally turned around, staring at Mason with a cold gaze. "To marry? I've already tried twice. Both were expensive lessons in how not to repeat mistakes. I want a son, Mason. Just that. No complications." Mason let out a low whistle. "Of course, because raising a child without complications is as simple as opening a bank account, right?" Robert ignored the sarcasm. "It was decided. That's what I would do." Mason rolled his eyes and left the room, muttering something about tycoons and their absurd ideas. Hours later, Robert was driving his car through the city. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the Lamborghini sped through congested streets. He stopped at a traffic light near a park, and something out of the ordinary caught his attention. A young woman, with worn clothes and a defiant look, walked between the cars asking for change. As she approached, Robert rolled down the window. "Do you have something for me?" she asked, with a tone that mixed tiredness and challenge. Robert looked at her for a moment before responding, "No, but I have a question. Are you open to proposals?" She tilted her head suspiciously as she frowned. "What kind of proposal? Because if that's what I'm thinking, I'd better speed up before I yell police." He let out a dry laugh. "Nothing like that. Let's just say it's an unusual job. But I need to make sure you're willing to listen." Her expression changed from skeptical to intrigued. "Right, I'm all ears." Robert pointed to the passenger seat. "Come in. We'll talk elsewhere." She hesitated for a moment, evaluating his intentions, but ended up accepting. When she closed the door, the muffled sound of the car made her sigh. "This is going to be interesting," he muttered. Robert looked at her from the corner of his eye and responded with a slight smile. "You can't even imagine." Sophie looked around as soon as she entered Robert's mansion. The luxury of the place was almost offensive, with marble floors that gleamed as if no one had ever set foot there, and enormous chandeliers that seemed worth more than your entire life. "Do you live here alone?" he asked, trying to hide his astonishment. "I don't usually share my space," Robert replied dryly. She laughed softly, but was interrupted by a tall man in a well-fitting suit who appeared ahead. "Ah, the boss's new project," Mason said with a mischievous smile. "Pleasure, I'm Mason, personal assistant and voice of conscience he rarely hears." Sophie raised an eyebrow, looking at Robert. "He has a sense of humor. How do you still keep him around?" Robert ignored the question, running his hand over his wristwatch as he glanced at Mason. "Prepare a room for her. Make sure you have everything you need." Mason smiled teasingly. Okay, but I hope she doesn't discover the secret room underground. It might be a little shocking. Sophie's eyes widened. Secret room? Is this a James Bond movie or just another eccentric mansion? Ignore him, Robert said with a sigh. He likes to make up stories. She laughed, but before she could respond, Mason led her into the hallway. I'll show you the room. Don't worry. The sheets are Egyptian cotton. Nothing short of the best here. And if you need anything, just ask. Well, minus a tour of that secret room. Sophie rolled her eyes, but couldn't help but smile. When she was finally alone, she sat down on the huge bed and took a deep breath. The weight of the decision he had made was beginning to show. Everything seemed surreal. She had traded the uncertainty of the streets for a contract she barely understood. The next morning, they sat down to discuss the details of the agreement. Robert, with his firm posture, analyzed a folder full of documents, while Sophie watched him. So basically you want a child, but without a wife, without complications, and without feelings, she asked with an ironic smile. Exactly. There is no need to mix emotions in something that can be resolved practically. Sophie crossed her arms. Practical. Of course. Because having a child is the most practical thing in the world. Robert finally looked at her with a slightly puzzled expression. Do you always use sarcasm to deal with serious situations? Only when they are absurd. But you can call me pragmatic if you want. He was silent for a moment, then returned his attention to his papers. I hope you understand that I'm not interested in discussing the merits of the agreement. Just tell me if you accept the terms. She tilted her head thoughtfully. Well, unlimited chocolate is not in the terms. Can we negotiate this? For the first time, Robert let out an almost imperceptible smile. I'll think about it. Sophie sat in one of the clinic's chairs, looking at the shiny reception desk. The smell of disinfectant was so strong, it almost made his eyes water. Robert was by his side, reading something on his cell phone, completely oblivious to the tension in the air. She crossed her arms, trying to break the silence. You know, the last time I was in a place this clean was... Oh, never, she said with a forced smile. The decor is great, if you like to look like you're in a spaceship. Robert looked away from the screen for a moment, giving him a brief glance. I prefer the environment to be efficient, not welcoming. She laughed softly. Of course, because comfort is overrated, right? Before he could respond, a nurse appeared, calling Sophie's name. She stood up, adjusting her blouse, and looked at Robert. You're staying here, right? You don't need to come and hold my hand. He frowned. I didn't plan on holding anything back. She just smiled and followed the nurse. The appointment was quick, but enough to make her even more nervous. When he returned to reception, Robert was already standing, adjusting his watch. Everything ready? He asked, with his usual neutrality. Yes. And by the way, this doctor is too serious. I think he has less facial expression than you. Robert ignored the comment and walked towards the exit. Sophie followed but couldn't resist teasing. You know, I think I'll name our future kid something fun. How about Tigress for the girl and Batman for the boy? He stopped and turned to her, raising an eyebrow. Naming the children is not part of the contract. She shrugged, smiling. Of course, but it would be more fun, don't you think? The following days were filled with appointments, exams, and long waits. Sophie's connection to the idea of creating a life began to grow, something she had never imagined for herself. During a break, she sat with Robert in the mansion's living room. He was reading a report, but Sophie couldn't contain herself. Have you ever thought about what it will be like when they arrive? He asked, breaking the silence. They? Yes, in the plural. Do you think there's only one coming? Because I have a feeling we're going to end up with twins, or triplets. Robert looked up for a moment. I don't make assumptions. I just prepare for any scenario. She laughed. Of course, always practical, as usual, but do you want to know? I hope there are 3. I think you deserve a little chaos." He just sighed, returning to the report, but there was a faint smile on the corners of his mouth. The delivery room was controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses circulated quickly, while Sophie held onto the bed, trying to breathe. Robert was at her side, clearly out of place, but determined to stay there. "You said you would be with me, but you didn't mention that you would be pale as a sheet," Sophie joked, between one contraction and another. "I'm perfectly fine," Robert replied, trying to maintain his composure, although his expression showed otherwise. "Of course it is, because this is a normal day, right?" Sophie gasped and squeezed his hand tightly. "I hope the contract includes compensation for broken hands." He looked at her seriously. "That's outside the terms." She let out a weak laugh, but it was interrupted by another contraction. The doctor appeared with a firm but calm look. "We're almost there. A few more breaths, Sophie." She looked at Robert, her eyes full of pain and determination. "Breaths! He talks like it's so easy. Why don't you try, Mr. Wallace?" Robert didn't respond, but held her hand more firmly, as if he wanted to convey some strength through the gesture. Finally, the sound of the first cry filled the room. Sophie relaxed momentarily, tears streaming down her face. "A boy," announced the doctor, as the baby was taken for initial care. Before she could process it, another cry echoed through the room. "Another boy," said the doctor with a slight smile. Sophie turned to Robert, exhausted but with a sparkle in her eyes. "I told you, twins!" But the doctor wasn't finished. "And we have one more. A girl." The third cry made Sophie laugh and cry at the same time. She looked at Robert, whose expression for the first time was completely vulnerable. "Triplets," he murmured, almost in disbelief. "Welcome to the chaos, Daddy," Sophie replied, her voice soft and tired. As the babies were brought out so Sophie could hold them, Robert remained silent, watching with a mixture of amazement and excitement. The three little ones were there, so fragile and perfect, and for the first time he felt something he couldn't calculate, predict, or control. Later, while Sophie rested, Robert was alone in his office, holding the contract that had governed everything up to that point. He looked at the papers and sighed. When Sophie woke up, she found Robert at the bedside, holding the torn pieces of the contract. "What did you do?" she asked, with a mixture of surprise and confusion. "I don't want our lives to be governed by clauses, Sophie. I can't bear the thought of you leaving. You are more than part of a deal. You are the mother of my children, and you are important to me." Sophie was silent for a moment, looking at him. Tears began to flow from her eyes. I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything. Just stay. For them. And for me." The mansion, once cold and impeccably silent, now pulsed with life. The triplets were scattered around the main room, surrounded by toys that seemed to multiply daily. Sophie was sitting on the floor, playing with the girl, while the two boys competed for the same teddy bear. Robert watched everything from the doorway, a small smile appearing on his face. Mason, as always, appeared at his side, a cup of coffee in his hand. "So, boss, how does it feel living in the middle of a war zone?" he provoked. "Surprisingly, well," Robert replied without taking his eyes off the scene in front of him. Mason raised his eyebrows. "Good. You used to run away from anything that wasn't predictable. This is pure chaos. I don't recognize you." Robert shrugged, but there was a calmness in his expression that Mason hadn't seen in years. "Maybe I've finally discovered that not everything needs to be controlled." Mason gave a slight smile and left, leaving Robert alone to join the family. Sophie looked at him as he approached with the baby in his lap. "Have you decided to leave your control tower to play with mortals?" she joked. "I'm here to supervise. We cannot let chaos take over everything." He sat next to her, catching one of the boys who tried to climb on his leg. "Supervision, of course, because you're great at it," Sophie smiled, leaning slightly to rest her head on his shoulder. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the triplets explore the world around them. Robert looked at Sophie, and for the first time said something he had been rehearsing for weeks. "Sophie, you know this is more than just about them, right?" His voice was softer, almost hesitant. She turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I want to say that when I tore up that contract, it wasn't just because of the babies. It was for you. You changed everything. My life, my way of seeing the world, even who I am." He held her hand, looking into her eyes. "I'm not good with words or feelings, but I want you to know, I love you." Sophie was silent for a moment, absorbing what he had just said. Then she smiled. "It took you all this time to say that. I was starting to think I'd have to make you sign another contract to admit it." Robert laughed, something rare but genuine. "Well, if it helps, I can guarantee you won't need clauses this time." Sophie leaned over and kissed him, while the triplets continued their antics around them. For a brief moment, the world seemed perfect. Months later, the mansion was the setting for a small, intimate wedding. Sophie wore a simple but stunning dress, while Robert, for once, looked completely at ease at an event that didn't involve numbers or contracts. The triplets were present, of course, being the loudest and most adorable guests at the ceremony. When Mason raised a glass to make a toast, he didn't miss the opportunity to joke. To those who thought they could control everything and ended up discovering that love doesn't follow clauses, congratulations, boss, and good luck, you'll need it. Robert just smiled as he looked at Sophie and the children. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had everything he needed. It wasn't about control or predictability. It was about love, chaos, and family.